Welcome to today's episode of The Growth Hack. Today we're going to talk about closing deals without the sleaze. To summarize that to a certain extent before we dive into the details, it's just meaning that the sellers out there, right, where they're all coming in and they're like, you've got to harass them for 3 months, twice a day. And in a sense, multi-touch marketing works. Yes, but I think it's how you do it that can make the difference in a successful business and a non-successful business, or a great reputation and not so great of a reputation. I know many salespeople who I would say they are true to heart. They believe in what they sell. They have a passion for it. They believe everything about it, and they don't harass you. And then I know maybe salespeople who I would say probably don't really believe in what they sell. They're just really good at harassing you until you feel pressured to make the decision. There is a big divide in the succession rate when you look at longevity. But I think for you, especially if you're a business owner or new to business, really thinking about building the relationship. Just as you would in your personal life, right? You don't want to go from A to Z really quickly. There is a nurture area where you need to learn about them. You need to be interested in them. You need to listen with intent. You need to do all of those things and think about them more than you think about me and what I want. And I try to do that in everything we do at the Growth Hack and AdCloud, is to put them first in everything, not thinking about our bottom line, not thinking about, how we're going to pay the bills or how we're going to increase revenue. I enter the conversation with, how can I help you? How can I go out of my way to solve a problem that you have, whether or not, if it's AdCloud or not? Now, naturally, right, the human side of us, we want that. We need that. That's how businesses run. But if you put the client first or you put the prospect first, I think you'll start to see that tenfold return, because they look at it and say, okay, this is a friend. They actually care about my business. They care about where that growth is. Really start to think about your relationships in business and your clients' relationships the same way that you would hope to be treated. You can digitally raise your hand. How many of us like when a solicitor shows up in your front doorstep and bombards you? I've got kids in the background that are running around the house, and the last thing I want to do is be standing at the front door being sold on lawn service. It's that same aspect of how you approach that scenario. I think some tactics when we look at that is, again, learn about your client. Let's say if you're in the B2B world, you have a call scheduled, spend time learning about them prior to that call. Understand what they do, what they sell as a business, and who they are personally. It's so easy today to find things out about people. You can go on LinkedIn, you can go on social media, find out what they like, what they do in their spare time. All of those things are great ways to make it a more personal conversation and become a friend and befriend them. That is essentially what I'm talking about when I'm saying that close deals without the sleaze. You don't have to harass people to get them to close. You have to appeal to their mental state and what they need to feel more solidified in who you are, what you can do, and how much you're willing to do for them. And if you can build that trust factor, that goes a long way in the relationship. We kind of break this down into the consumer side, right? You're a business owner, you have consumers coming in. What's the first thing that you have to do to get a conversion? Whether that's in e-com or that's B2B, it's build trust. The best way to build trust is to humanize yourself, especially in the small business world. For them to understand you are a person, you have a family, you have needs, you have wants, and you have this business that is hopefully a solution to the problem that they have, whether big or small. But how you communicate that is important. Even when we're talking about marketing and ad copy, which is what we do day in and day out, taking that ad copy that used to be so pinpointed and blunt and overly salesy and breaking it down into everyday discussions to where people can understand, they can also feel you on the other side. Just like reading a book. There's books that you read and you can kind of feel like the person is there, is speaking the words. You kind of get inside the mind of the writer. And that's how it should be when you're running ads. They should be able to kind of feel that intent behind it, not just say, hey, come buy it because this is cool. But then really taking a second to step back and say, if someone was selling to myself the way that I'm selling to everyone else, how would I feel? Would it make me feel approachable? Would I want to buy from me? And I think that is a question you should wake up every day and ask yourself. What I want to buy from myself and how I pitch it and how I present myself, or am I solely focused on the next dollar? Again, it's not a bad thing to focus on where revenue is coming from because that's a necessity. But when that becomes the most important part of your business, you forget about the relationships, you forget about the customers, and running a business is a marathon, not a sprint. And 1 to 5 years from now, that'll come back to bite you because you didn't focus on building the trust of the customers. And I always say there is a lot more revenue to be made from your current clients and customers than there is from new customer acquisition. If you treat your new customers right now, they're likely to come back and buy more from you, refer more from you, which will lead to your new client acquisition. So I would kind of challenge you to just take some of those pointers and go and write down and say, which side of the aisle are you on? Are you a little bit more forward in your approach for sales? But do you lean a little bit more towards that side? And I think we all naturally have at some point without correction. I think that's just natural state of mentality. But write those things down and then start to look at ways to correct that and be better about that. And really focus on at least 80% about the customer, 20% about you. Every call I do, I start in with, I want to know more about you. I don't need to jump into the call and tell you who I am, what I do. All of my accolades aside don't really matter because they're not going to solve your problem right now if I don't understand you and your problem today. I want to kind of divide up e-commerce, right? Because there's a lot of people in e-commerce and maybe brick and mortar. Let's start off with e-com because I think that's one area where we constantly see e-commerce brands, there's get in their life. We have to sell. And everything about us to sell. We need $1 million a month. We need 150 shirts sold a day. While I can appreciate the want in all of those things, you first have to start with selling t-shirt number one, right? Or whatever that product may be. But then also it's about building trust. And people nowadays can clearly see through those that want to produce and send a message and build trust and build community versus I'm looking for the next dollar. I have no personal interest in you. I just need that dollar, right? There is a big difference. But for brands, we've worked with numerous brands across the board. If you want to be the Nikes of this world and you want to be around for many, many years, you have to put the customer first. And it's not to say that these major brands have gotten it right every day of the week, but they've learned from their mistakes. They've transitioned, they've evolved with time. Right now, society is so evolved digitally wise when it comes to marketing and consumer behavior and who brands they buy into and the mission behind that. I think for a long time, we just naturally were just buying things. And now we want to be a part of things that are just different, that have a soul mission, that are purposeful. It's important to step outside of that and really start to be authentic in your communication. And when you set on the streamway of, hey, this is who I am, this is who our brand is, this is what we're going to be about, stick with that and live with that. Try not to waver day to day based on if your sales are up or down. And that is one of the hardest things to do is to not let your mentality shift of, well, we didn't have such a great month or quarter, whatever that, so let's completely rip out and transition. Now, there are things to test and change, but your core values should stay the same. Your core mission should stay the same. You shouldn't be changing everything about that to go in this new direction because you think that, hey, we're one thing today, but if we change to that tomorrow, we're going to get 120% more in sales. I think it's important to be transparent about your offers, avoid overselling, especially in the e-com world. Now, you switch over to the service side, and we're talking brick and mortars and the beauty industry. We'll just pick out the beauty industry. You're one-to-one with clients daily. So you are forced to communicate, and how you communicate can determine the longevity of that client relationship. And, if you were to ask me, I would say, I think everyone in the beauty industry, service-based industry, should go through some type of communications training to help you better understand how people tick, like what makes people act a certain way, because they come and they sit in your chair for an hour plus, and there is nothing but opportunity there to learn about that they do what they like, why they came to you, why they chose you. Those things can also feed how you market. It helps you understand what that persona is and why they're coming in and why they keep coming back. And again, everything I think really summarizes and goes back to active listening. Emphasize that like the understanding of the client's needs before pitching them anything that you have. You need to really understand where they are, what they want, and where they need to be. And also avoid overpromising, because it is one of the most common things, but one of the worst, right? You can always tell if someone's overpromising, it's because they're solely focused on the revenue in return, not the client. If you deliver what you actually and say, hey, this is what I actually can do. Maybe I can't do X, Y, and Z, but I can do some of this, but I think we can learn along the way. I think clients value that authenticity far more than someone who overpromises with expectation and then under-delivers, which hurts your reputation, makes it harder to get a referral. And that is across every industry, maybe not e-com because it's not as one-to-one. To a certain extent, though, reviews are your number one driver. If you're overpromising the quality of this hoodie, for example, and they get it and they don't like it, that can be detrimental to your future if it's not as you claim. And then understanding the power of storytelling. I think that how your product, your service, or yourself are making it relatable, taking kind of the client's challenge, your solution, and the transformation or success story. You have to really be able to tell a story in a really good way. People zone into people who are really good storytellers. I can't remember, it was like a podcast I was watching on the brand story, and he said the best storytellers are some of the best listeners, which I think is really interesting because it's a contradiction in listening and actually speaking. But the more that you listen and understand what they need, the better story that you can tell, fulfilled with details of what they actually need and that understanding. It's hard to tell a story if you don't understand its origin. It's those two things that have to go together to create this really good ecosystem across the board. As we kind of look at this and things that you should kind of take away, make trust building a primary goal. Make sure that you go into every interaction, whether that's in person with a customer, on the phone, whether that's from your ads that you're running, your marketing material, your copywriting, and put trust building at the forefront of it. Put the consumer at the forefront and talk about them, understanding where they are and what they need, personalizing your outreach and tailoring your communication. All of this goes back to active listening. If you understand who your potential client is and where they are, it'll feed everything else that you need to do in business. Using stories to connect. Again, you can only use those stories if you've been listening to the last 50 clients. It is the best way to curate some of those things. And then avoiding high pressure tactics. Put down most of the sales books. Now, this is not to say every sales book is bad, but the ones that are saying, hey, you need to hit them 18 times a day and you need to call and pressure. Listen, pressure sales often result in a very short-term transaction. They buy in because they're not ready, but they feel pressured to, and they get into that. And we see this in the marketing world all the time. Agencies will pressure you into doing it, and you sign a 6-month contract. On the other side, unless your results are astronomically great, which I would say for most agencies that pressure, they're usually not, the owner on the other side, or the client on the other side, is just vying and waiting for that 6 months to end. And that's not the place that you want to be. You want to build a friendship along the way to make sure that they feel comfortable, that they understand you. And then start to track your long-term impact of ethical selling. Again, I think if you track that in client loyalty and revenue and referrals that came in from there, it'll be far greater than anything you've ever received by pressuring someone into something when they weren't ready, where they just didn't feel like they understood enough. Or maybe they feel like you don't have the skill set for that. Those are some key points that you can take and use to understand how to sell to leads better, build better relationships and results. Especially, we live a lot in the franchising industry. It's one big family. It's an area where building relationships is extremely important. I've had relationships from 5 to 7 years back, come back full circle 7 years later. But it all started just from a conversation of listening, connecting, understanding, and then letting that kind of grow over time. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today, and we'll catch you on the next one.